The prophecy of Isaiah. This is the 7th presentation in this series with the title, There is Hope. Isaiah had met King Ahaz and challenged him. If you don't stand firm in your faith, if you don't get God back in the center of things, you will not stand at all. True security for the leader and the people of God comes from God. Ahaz was negotiating with the enemy Assyria, and it backfired very badly. As humans, we look at things from our perspective. And Ahaz thought that Israel and Syria were the major threat. But Isaiah reveals God's perspective. The real threat is Assyria, the empire. Ahaz didn't listen, and disaster followed. There are two choices. As the people of God, we can allow God into the practicalities of everyday living. We can seek His ways and follow Him. That makes sense of things and enables us to cope. God is with us. But in the days of Ahaz, and indeed in the West today, God has been squeezed out of public life. He's been squeezed out of the ordinary daily things of living, and we've confined Him to church buildings and to ritual and performance. And He's like a stumbling block. And you see it in our society where God is blamed. Happened then, it happens today. In those days the people refused to listen to God, and they saw no light at the end of the dark tunnel of all the nations round about them. They looked for all kinds of answers, and Ahaz was typical, but none of them have any answers. So a blame culture sets in. Happened then, and it's growing today. People shrug their shoulders and say it doesn't matter who you vote for, it doesn't matter what you do, nothing changes. And morally and ethically the society then lost its way. And morally and ethically the society of the West today is losing its way. Push God out, that's the effect. But Isaiah reveals that despite all the gloom, they were up to the neck in it, but not overwhelmed completely. They weren't listening to God. They tried to solve their problems and they didn't work. And Isaiah saw that the northern areas, which had suffered first and worst, that's where the breakthrough would start. God was going to allow the people to move into exile. They'd chosen to come away from God, to move out of His protection, to do it their own way, to reject His ways. They were overrun. But eventually the penny dropped. And God by His grace would come and reveal a better way. That is very, very true. We bring it on ourselves by our self-willed determination to do it ourselves and not to listen to God. And this is being spoken to the people of God. And we're doing it today in our churches and Christian groups. And we've got to come to the end of ourselves and our puny self-effort of religious performance, pushing God to the edge. Because when the penny drops, God lovingly by His grace can come in and help us. And Isaiah breaks through with that picture. Despite all the mess, all the disasters that were coming, all the disasters that were around them, all the uncertainty, all the ethical and moral confusion in the land, all the evil that was abounding, despite all of that, nevertheless, all the distress the people were suffering. And the land of the north of Zebulun and Naphtali, they'd suffered worst. But from these areas, God would come. Isaiah saw that. And we now, with hindsight, can look back and see how Jesus fulfilled it. So let's look at what Isaiah actually says. These are familiar words. The people walking in darkness, that's the people who'd suffered in the land, have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. You have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest, as warriors rejoice when dividing the plunder. For as in the days of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor. Every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning and will be fuel for the fire. For to us a child is born. To us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing it and holding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. Now, we often have this read to us at the time of Christmas, but see it in its context. Bursting through and breaking through, as Isaiah saw and captured something of the mind of God. The land was in a mess. They were being threatened by 4 nations round about them. And Isaiah's revealed to King Ahaz, they're not the real problem. The real problem is Assyria from the far north. It's going to sweep over you. It's going to take everything over. You'll be up to the neck in it. But God will still be with you. And with the birth of his son was the reminder that God was still with them, that they were going to be able to survive somehow, despite all they'd brought on themselves by their rebellion and disobedience. They'd moved away from God's protection, and life was pretty horrendous. And then bursting into this, Isaiah sees a longer-term picture. That describes the situation pretty accurately. The nation of Judah, Israel, was almost by that stage wiped out. The nation of Judah had lost its way completely. They wouldn't be able to solve their problems, but God would bring a light. They didn't earn it, they didn't deserve it, they couldn't expect it. But eventually the penny would drop and the people would learn through their experiences and through the exile. They would become desperate. They would want something better. And when they want something better, they turn to God, and God then comes and brings his illumination. Oh, we forfeit God's blessings so often by our rebellion and disobedience. God is longing to bless us, but we think we can do it better ourselves. And joy replaces the fear that they had at that time. They were terrified of the Syrians. The Syrians were violent and brutal. They wantonly tortured people to death just for the fun of it. And they were facing that. But joy would come. But it wouldn't come in the form of violence, in one form replacing another form. Oh, so often we go down that road. He reminds them of the days of Midian, when the land was faced with similar problems centuries before, and God had come through the life of the great prophetic figures of that time and had released them because people had learned to trust God. The same thing will happen again. But it's not violence replacing violence. And your picture here is of the implements of violence being burned and destroyed, because violence will be defeated by God's love. We've got to stop and ponder that and think that through. So often in our Christian groups, we think if we only had more resources, more people, more power, we could, as it were, impose God's way in the nation. That is not biblical thought. And we've gone down that cul-de-sac so often historically. And we're still having to learn that it does not work. The way of victory is the way of God's love. That self-sacrificing love. Think of all Jesus came to say and do. We don't win the battles by becoming stronger physically, more violent if you like. That never works. And it's not God's way, and He will not honor it. We do not do it, if you like, in modern language, by imposing a Christian viewpoint on a nation. There are signs of that occurring in some nations in the West and the world today. It will backfire. It doesn't work. We outlove people. We swamp them with God's love, even when we pay a terrible penalty for it. That wins the victory. That was God's way. And it's His way through us today. Oh, we have so much to learn. And Isaiah implicitly is picturing it here. And these wonderful words. But in that simple word, what Isaiah is saying here, this is how God's going to do it. This is how God would achieve the outcome, the victory. Can you think of anything weaker and more vulnerable than an infant, utterly dependent on parents, particularly the mother? A life that could be snuffed out and destroyed almost instantly. And to us, for to us a child is born. This is God's way, through vulnerability. He comes. And Isaiah had been given the vision through the birth of his own son. And now he sees that this is a kind of picture model which is for something much, much bigger and greater. You see, God does not work that way. God works through people's lives, vulnerable people's lives, the yous and the me's. He doesn't work through theological abstractions and rule books and regulations. That's religion. Doesn't work. God came vulnerable and an infant boy, born into poverty, born into opposition, born into a land which was torn apart with evil. That's God's way, and it's His way always through us as well. He doesn't declare His truth with some clarion call from the skies or some textbook. Truth comes in a person. That's how Jesus could say, I am the truth. And that is always true. And we have to learn that lesson as God's people today. God expresses Himself to the societies of the West through the people of God and through the events that we face and how we handle them. He's there for us. But God comes and expresses Himself through vulnerability and through giving of Himself. There's the model. And we start to throw around our weight, when we start to parade our religious pomposity, when we start to confine God to our church buildings and to rituals and performance, to conclaves and events, it doesn't work. God expresses Himself through you and through me as we listen to Him and as we make ourselves vulnerable in this world in love. What a deep and wonderful thought. But it happens also to work because it's true. There's a vivid contrast painted here by Isaiah. King Ahaz was weak. He vacillated. He didn't know what to do. Uncertain. He wouldn't listen to good advice. And he led the country into a spiral of destruction, and many people suffered as a result of it. Isaiah pictured a king who was coming. This king could bring the end to wars. He could establish a kingdom based on justice and righteousness. Justice and righteousness which had gone from the nation of Israel at that stage. Nobody could get justice. There was no ethical morality set up at all. Corruption and evil and violence were ruling in the nation. But God, through this king, would express the truth of himself. And God does it through us today. The contrast is there. There was Ahaz. And much of Ahaz appears, sadly, amongst the people of God today. We look for resources. We set up our committee meetings, our decisions. We ask God to rubber stamp our plans. We've thought it through. But we don't live for God. Because God alone brings light, hope, and destiny. And sometimes we have to learn how to be vulnerable in love, rather than organized and systematized in our planning. That is a hard lesson for us to learn today. Ahaz failed. In all of this, there's a kind of paradox. Yahweh, the great name that the people of God used for the God who was their God, the God of Judah. Faced with all the enemies and all the onslaughts from every direction round about, weak, without resources, humanly without any means whatsoever to survive. How is God going to deliver them? They drifted into an arrogance where they thought they knew better than God. They depended on warfare. They were building up their armaments and resources. The society was being run on oppression where the rich oppressed the poor. There was no justice. And force was being used. And the danger is we think that if we can just do it a bit better, we'll win. That is the danger for us as the people of God today. You can see it in the conclaves and events and meetings in our church leaderships today. That element can be seen. And it does not work. Because God's way to break through was to come in the vulnerability of a child, an infant, born with nothing. God's way of breaking through is by becoming transparent and humble. Vulnerable love in a society which is attacking us from every side. God with us in all our human weakness. We've got to get down on our knees in our church groups and leadership groups and seek that way. It's a major paradigm. God's deliverance and strength comes through vulnerability and weakness. There's the paradox. And Isaiah saw it so clearly. With the birth of his son, before the son had reached perhaps about the age of 2, Isaiah was shown by God that God himself would intervene, that the threats that Ahaz feared from the Syria-Israel confederacy would vanish. They would go. And this child symbolized that God had not let his people down. He would see them through. The picture, and it was a living picture, because the child was there and grew up. God was still there for his people, even when they were up to the neck in it. But through that picture, God revealed to Isaiah something bigger, which he passed on to us. And with hindsight, we can now see the meaning of it. Something more glorious, that God's intervention would come in the birth of a child, that the child would be totally human, but totally with the fullness of God, God with us, Emmanuel. The word that had been given to Isaiah that's used 3 times in these chapters, this would be fulfilled on a bigger scale. This was a principle. And God used the events in Isaiah's life, through the birth of his own son, to illustrate and to show something much, much bigger, much more glorious, that would provide the answer for the rebellion of God's people. Gives us hope, but also gives the model of how God works, which is still the same for us today. Look at the pictures Isaiah brings to us. In the original, that's one phrase. We don't separate it as a wonderful and a counselor. It's wonderful counselor. And that's the contrast with the human folly that you could be seen in the leadership classes of the nation at that time. There would be true wisdom there. The phrase there are some people have tried to explain that away as a great hero. No, the phrase is always used of God. That the king who was coming would be fully God, would be able to absorb all the evil and lead the people forward. And he'd be like an everlasting father. Again, one phrase. Fatherhood that is permanency, sacrificing itself for the benefit of the child. Jesus sacrificed himself willingly for humanity and for the people who would come to him. And he would not replace one kind of violence with another. That's Islamic thought. Jesus was the Prince of Peace, is the Prince of Peace. He brings peace, not by some kind of violent suppression of the opposition, but by transparent vulnerability. There is nothing more vulnerable than an infant born into this world. Isaiah grasped this magnificent picture. There's the text again. Isaiah saw that this child would come and would replace and fulfill the monarchy of Judah, which had failed. And Ahaz reveals the failure so vividly. The government will be on his shoulders. Leadership of God's people in the days of Isaiah, their leadership had failed miserably. And as a result, the people of God had drifted into an ethical, moral confusion. And the rich got richer, the poor got poorer. The law courts were unjust, bribery ruled, conspiracies were everywhere. And the people suffered. A failed monarchy, a failed leadership. There would come a child who would grow to be a leader, who by contrast would be totally different. I don't know whether Isaiah would have grasped the significance of this. A kingship that would be permanent, there will be no end. Of the greatness of his government and peace, there will be no end. How could a king be there forever and ever? Now with hindsight we can see how Jesus fulfills that completely and beautifully. The kingdom of God is here when people choose to go God's way. The door is open, Jesus welcomes us in, and he makes it possible for us to become adopted into God's family through all he did and achieved through his life, death and resurrection. And he is the king, not a church leader, not a church hierarchy, not an organization, not a religious structure. He is the king. And he runs the government. He decides what's going to happen. And he brings it in peace. He'll be reigning on David's throne and over his kingdom, but justice and righteousness will characterize it. These were the two great properties that were vanishing from the land of Judah amongst the people of God at that time. They've been sacrificed on selfishness and greed, willfulness and disobedience, rebellion against God, people in it for what they could get. The powerful got more powerful and the rest went to the wall. And there's a lot of that happening in the world today, where the innocent suffer grievously. But he would bring justice and righteousness. God's ways. There would be utter fairness. And in the original, a word that doesn't really exist, zealousy and jealousy, they're essentially the same, zeal and jealousy. God's concern and love for his people is so great. God's concern and love for humanity is so great. God gets angry when anything messes us up. And he'll stand against it. And God's love for you and me, for humanity down through the centuries, his desire to bring the best for humans, his creation, he alone will bring this to come to be. A passage that's worth reading again and again and pondering and praying through. A beautiful picture. Taking a little bit of it out. This is a kingdom on a different scale. A different scale from anything that's ever been seen before. Isaiah could never have invented this. He could never have created this. But because of the great vision in chapter 6, he had grasped God's nature at a different level. At a different level of relationship. The first 5 chapters of Isaiah, it's clear that Isaiah had got the message right. He understood the situation. He could see what was going to happen. He was giving correct warnings. But in chapter 6, God breaks through and raises the whole horizon. Shows him things on a bigger scale because Isaiah could see a bigger God, the God of the universe. And Isaiah was grasping here that God was coming in power, coming vulnerable, an infant boy, born into a messy, antagonistic, evil world, coming to a rebellious people. And he would set up a kingdom that was characterized by justice and righteousness, where everyone was treated well, where love ruled, justice and righteousness, God's ways. But it was a kingdom on a different scale. A different kind of kingdom from anything that you saw in this world. It's not a kingdom of this world, as Jesus made clear. It's the kingdom of God, where we enter it by saying, I want something better. I've messed up. And we come to God and admit that we can't. And we're wanting him to show us and enable us for something better. Here is the King that came as a vulnerable infant. God's way of love for rebellious humanity. What a picture. And what a vision of hope Isaiah brought. A vision of hope that the people then didn't get. They didn't understand it. They went their own rebellious way. And they chose the way of moving away from God. And it took a long, long time before the penny dropped. And they realized they needed something better. And even then, in the days of Jesus, many still wanted to do it their way. And lost out on all this kingdom could offer to them through Jesus. You see, we tend to think of power, strength, even violence. Now, you may be put off by the word violence, but as I move around churches, how often I see people wanting their own way, and by all kinds of means imposing it on others, through the rules of the group, through pressure, through attacking others, verbally, pulling others down. That's not the way of Jesus. We have got to learn as God's people not to go the way of power, strength, violence, and to depend on the physical resources that we can accumulate. God's way that underpins His kingdom is vulnerability, transparency, and a love that puts others first, no matter what the cost is for ourselves. That's the way of Jesus. In the world today, look at our political systems so often, and sometimes our religious systems. It happened in the days of Isaiah, Tiglath-Pileser. He was a usurper that grabbed the power, and he was very capable. He then set about eliminating all the rivals by killing them. And how often that happens in our society today, in our political world. The election is won, and the ambitious leader, often for good motives, consolidates their own power base by bringing in their own friends and advisors around them and ignoring those who hold different perspectives and views. But sadly, it can happen within our church communities. And we get them built around one leader who, with good intentions, is not doing it the way of Jesus, and will forfeit all that God has for that group in the longer run. It's a kingdom that's on a different scale. It's a kingdom that's completely different in character and nature. We've got to think about that, ponder it through, and see how it works for us today. The Syrian Empire, and that was the only way of those days. Empires were competing and jockeying for power with each other. Ruthless expansionism, and destroying and putting down and controlling the people they'd conquered. That's not the way of Jesus. We don't come and impose our Christian views on others. That's not the way of Jesus. It's not the way of this kingdom. It's totally different. The coming kingdom as Isaiah saw it, and history shows it, still there. Jesus is still king, and the kingdom can expand the piece out if only we will listen to and follow it and do it His way. A way that's built on justice and righteousness. This is the picture, and then it grows. There's so much misinformation flying around, but in fact the people of God throughout the world are expanding numerically. The kingdom is growing. It's growing faster than any other group. But it's hidden. It's vulnerable. And it's growing the way of Jesus. It's the only way for growth. The coming kingdom would be different. We'd love that. And in the days of Isaiah, the society was a mess. That was happening all over the place. And the great prophetic figures had come against it again and again, and the leadership had not listened. And the spiritual landmarks of the people of God were steadily being erased. They'd largely been erased in the northern kingdom of Israel, and they were going rapidly in the south. what was going to happen. But so much of our human cultures are based on violence. It doesn't matter whether you go to capitalism, fascism, communism, or Islamism. They all do it the same way. An in-group imposes their ways on the others. Just ponder it. It's true, isn't it? I've called them the ruling classes. Whether they're brought in by democratic elections or they're self-appointed or appointed by an inner group, it's always the way. Imposing their views, they gain power, they eliminate rivals, they impose their wishes, and they employ strength and violence, coercion in some form to get their way. And there's just as much violence in the abuse of capital and money as there is in any other form of violence, where the poor have no chance. God's people, historically and indeed today, Isaiah would speak to us and say we've got it a bit wrong, badly wrong. We've been infiltrated by the thought forms of the cultures of the day. The kingdom that Jesus brought, the kingdom that Isaiah pictured, is totally different in character and nature. And we've gone the ways of gaining power, eliminating rivals, imposing our wishes, employing strength and some sort of violence. We're all doing it. And it's infiltrated the people of God too often. Isaiah pictures something that blows our minds. Vulnerability. Sacrificial love. God with us, coming in a vulnerable infant boy, coming into humanity to rescue us from all the mess that we've made of our societies and life. It's quite different, and God works in a different way. And Isaiah grasped it amidst all the mess of his society and day, and he passed it on to us. Let's seek that way for the future. And in the next part we will look at God's message